Orzala is the director of the Kabul-based think tank Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit. She's also a senior teaching fellow at the University of London. During the pandemic, Orzala spoke with me remotely from London.
Does it bode well, or does it make it even more frightening the future, given the fact that we're hearing so much about the U.S. troops withdrawing?
Now, at this particular phase, the U.S. is basically having presence together with its allies. Unfortunately, the 20 years, if we put the 20 years into two parts, some investment that has been made on the infrastructure, on the human capital, on girls' education, on health sector and all that, these are the good things that happened. A country in an absolute destitute level in terms of poverty received billions of dollars. Not that all that money made it to Afghanistan, but they brought some level of advancement, they brought some level of education, some level of opportunities for people to breathe some air. But at the same time, violence never ended in the last 20 years. We've had worse type of violence. Those violent groups like Taliban, who were only violent towards their opponents, turned to be violent against anyone. Women, children, doctors, targeting anyone. They became so violent that it's very difficult to now trust that any kind of current sort of talks or negotiations will really end this cycle, this vicious cycle of violence, because it somehow is internalized in these fighters' minds. So it will require a very long term, whether US troops stay in Afghanistan or they leave. I think for an immediate future, unfortunately, violence is going to be part of our everyday situation.
In early 2020, the United States and the Taliban signed a peace deal that promised the withdrawal of all U.S. troops. Later that year, the Afghan government and the Taliban reached a preliminary deal for a peace process. But despite the ongoing negotiations, the violence has continued.
The recent weeks or the recent months has an unprecedented level of violence targeting specifically women leaders or women who are working in public. We had 3 young female journalists being shot in eastern province of Nangarhar. A woman doctor, we don't have many female doctors, but a woman doctor has been killed, basically assassinated. We see this series of assassinations happening, and it's to do with, I believe, the fear that certain forces have from the empowerment of women. Because in the past, women were average, victim of war, like women and children being most vulnerable part of the society. But targeting women, human rights activists, women working as doctors, as journalists, as aid workers, for example, humanitarian aid workers have been killed as well. These are an indication of realizing the empowerment of women as a threat, which is quite unfair, I believe. And that's the new sort of phase in this 4-decade-long war that we are in at the moment.
Orzala is a longtime champion for girls' education. According to World Bank figures, the literacy rate among Afghan men is about 56%, but it's less than 30% among women. For any peace deal to succeed, Orzala says it must include education, political participation, and economic opportunities for Afghan women. Let me ask you, because you talked a little bit about the advances for girls and women during this period of time. Are you fearful of that backsliding as you look to the future?
I am fearful, but not much. I'm fearful because some really conservative elements within our society, such as the Taliban, such as the conservative parts of the society that are not necessarily Taliban, they're part of the current allies, but they are conservative, they will find much more possibilities to pressurize women, as they have already started to do that. And that would make the life and the struggle of women for equal rights quite challenging. In the last 20 years, we had the advantage of having the world standing with us. I'm not very optimistic to what extent the world will still stand with us as we move ahead with all the things that are happening globally. At this point, so that's the reason that I'm aware of the fact that we are going to have a very challenging phase in our history, in our struggle for women's rights. But I'm also optimistic because I think the advancement that the women in Afghanistan and girls in Afghanistan have made, they are irreversible. And they are not limited to a small community of women in the urban centers, or like some people say, people like me, you know, who are Western educated and all that. We are a small minority, that's true. But the advancement, this thinking that women are not these passive, you know, members of the family is no longer there. Women in the Afghan villages and the very local and remote parts are quite active, and they want their place in decision making, whether this is decision making of their families or their communities or even broader localities and local governance. We have now mayors who are women. We have governors. We have women in the security forces. We have to remember that Afghanistan is a very traditional society. This traditional society has become the subject of regional and global interventions. So some things in this traditional society have changed, even in the mindset of men who are feeling more proud for their daughters to be educated rather than being embarrassed for their daughters to be educated.
Orzala's own upbringing represents the country's tumultuous history in recent decades.
Let's talk about one woman specifically, and that woman would be you. Tell us about your childhood in Afghanistan, making the transition into Pakistan. Just give us your background, and what does it tell us about the journey of women in Afghanistan?
Well, thank you. I think my life story probably is not very different from the life story of probably millions of girls. I was born to an educated parents in Kabul. My mother was a teacher. My father is an architect, engineer. We lived in Kabul. I spent my childhood there, went to school up to 6th grade in Kabul. And the beginning of civil war in Afghanistan pushed us to migrate to Pakistan. So around 1989, when I was about 11 years old, we moved to Pakistan. We became refugee, like millions of Afghans being refugees in Pakistan. The first thing that was quite shocking to me was the fact that there were no possibility for me to go to school. So I spent a year basically, now I can use the term lockdown, basically completely locked down. So fast forward, I've completed a high school level education in Pakistan and returned back to Afghanistan in 1998, only a few years after the Taliban was ruling. And one thing that left with me from that first trip to Kabul, aside from, you know, the emotional side of seeing things completely, you know, different than when I left them, it was the sort of unprecedented level of thirst for education and a serious concern that every single family from my relatives were sharing with me about the future of their daughters. Somehow that touched me quite closely as a person who was not able to get educated for a year and a half myself. I felt quite close to those girls who weren't able to go to school for, at that time, for 2-3 years, by that time, 1998. So I came back, and having the little experience of running a home-based literacy class for my neighbors in the refugee camp where I was living, I sort of come up with an idea of forming a local non-governmental organization that would help girls' education. So we started with some models or with some examples of doing these kind of classes in Peshawar city, Pakistan, basically to help refugee girls get educated and to help the street children in Peshawar city to get educated. And slowly we started our networks within Afghanistan trying to organize these home-based literacy classes. So within 99, 2000, 2001, we had hundreds of women, but in very small groups, going and attending these classes in their neighborhoods and trying to learn how to read and write.
According to the World Health Organization, more than 2,600 Afghans have died of the coronavirus, with more than 60,000 confirmed cases as of May 2021. But the true scale of COVID-19's effect in Afghanistan has been impossible to measure given the ongoing violence.
Let me ask you about, this diet of violence. I imagine compounding that environment of war and then having COVID-19 on top of it. Describe how difficult it's been for Afghanistan with the pandemic.
Well, pandemic affected Afghans probably not necessarily similar ways that it affected Europe and US, or for that matter, probably China, but very similar to some of the other developing countries. But I believe that Afghanistan was probably one of the first countries that managed to have a herd immunity, in the sense that a huge number of people have all been infected by the virus, and big majority survived. A significant number also couldn't make it. And the numbers of death at one stage during last May, June, these 2 months were quite high. But very soon after that massive, infection numbers, then things got slower. And because of the travel restrictions, we didn't have a lot of cases of pandemic. But general things that happened, I think, in Afghanistan, the pandemic affected the worst the small and medium-sized enterprises. And if I can say, the middle class were the worst affected, because in the rest of the world, in the West, for example, you can sit at home and you will get 80% of your salary, or 70% of your salary. But in Afghanistan, at one point, there were people with small professions like small shopkeepers, small businessmen, the professional people like masons, carpenters, people who work in construction. All of them were left without any jobs. I think it fell the level of poverty further, and a higher number of people sort of joined this massive group of poor, because poorest of the poor were anyway not having anything to lose, but it was more the medium, sort of small and medium enterprise holders that were worst affected. Another disappointing fact is that parties to conflict, particularly the Taliban, but also the government, because of their defensive position, they could not succeed in respecting a humanitarian ceasefire. The Taliban made it very clear that COVID or non-COVID, the killing and violence will go on. So unfortunately, Afghanistan passed this year of a global pandemic, not only dealing with the global pandemic, and of course, due to weak governance with the corruption that resulted in not, material reaching to the people. It also was a year that was full of violence, full of military offensives that resulted in a lot of civilian casualties, and a lot of innocent lives have been taken away.
What's it going to take to build a peaceful, stable Afghanistan, do you think?
I think a conflict that took the time of nearly, or a little more than, or less than my own life, it's very difficult to take out of this only by our own people. So a global dedication and a global commitment is required to bring Afghanistan to a peaceful and stable environment. or a peaceful and a stable point. And that's only possible by drying up the sources of violence, drying up the sources of terrorism in Afghanistan, and using terrorism as a means to achieve certain goals. So what makes me very optimistic is that the younger generation, those who are in their 20s now, they were born right after the changes. They have had relatively more privileges than we had in my time, or earlier, or my generation. I believe when they raise up, they will not accept to become the sort of loyal of the outside interests. They will hopefully take the lead and build this country and bring it to a better place than what it is now.
Well, we are going to end on that hopeful note. I hope your vision of the future of Afghanistan is as you just described it. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Pleasure. Thank you.